morning. All right, good morning. We're going to get started. So first off, thanks for joining us today. When they flip these slides on in a second, you'll see that you are here at the Architecture of Lightning Web Components talk, also known as the Ask Me Anything of the Architects panel. So to get started, let's do a quick round of introductions for the 4 people up on stage. I'm Kevin Venkateshwaran. I'm one of the architects in UI Platform and one of those people responsible for Lightning Web Components. And I'm joined today by Katie Patino, Diego Val, who are the other 2 architects, and the 3 of us over a 2-year period worked very hard together to create the foundation of Lightning Web Components. And we're joined also by Kevin Hill, who represents product management of Lightning Web Components as well. So you have the full list that are responsible for this. We're going to have some great and very difficult questions, I'm sure, from you, and it's going to be a good time. So the standard, if we can get the slides up, please. Got some lovely photos, great. And so next up, of course, the standard disclaimer, forward-looking statement, make your purchasing decisions based off what's already available. We're going to say as architects a bunch of things that are inappropriate. Product management's going to tell us that we should be quiet.
Don't ship it.
Standard safe harbor applies effectively to everything we're going to talk about today. All right, quick agenda. We're going to do a quick 10-ish minutes on sort of history and sort of conceptual model of how we think about Lightning Web Components. And we want to share that with you, so hopefully you take that away. And when you're building components, when you're building the platform, you apply that same conceptual model to understand how we got there, where we are, and where we're going. So starting with that, I'm going to pass it to Katie for an abridged history.
All right. Sure. So quickly, we started this process like 3 years ago. About 3 years ago, we were midway through the development of the Lightning platform, so we decided, okay, let's check what we have, get some feedback from you. This is some of the feedback, really quickly, not covering everything. We identified that you really wanted to use the tools that you were already familiar with. That was important. Also, you wanted to have this common component model that you could understand, similar to what is out there, different frameworks, and a few other things, especially performance as well, was an important topic. Among these things, most of it is about productivity, being more productive when using our platform. And we identified that problem. Additionally, you also were very, very, very passionate about what you don't want to see in a platform happening. Breaking changes is always the elephant in the room. Additionally, you don't want to be using old technology. You want to really use the latest technology that is out there available for everyone. And you don't want to be in a walled garden of Salesforce platform. You want to use things inside a platform that you can also use outside of the platform and such. So those are some of the core feedback that we got from some of you. And that makes us a little bit of a pivoting on the roadmap to try to start spending more time thinking about the future. The realization there was that our platform, the Lightning platform, actually shared the same constraints and features of the web platform, the underlying platform. This platform has been able to evolve over time, is backward compatible. Those things are very important, and we happen to share the same things. So this is sort of the reason why we decided to invest in LWC, the reason why we decided to start looking into web components and web standards to see what we can do to really evolve the platform that we have at the time into something that is really compelling for people to build inside Salesforce and outside Salesforce. That's really the gist of why we're doing this. And Kevin will get into the details of what exactly we're doing, and then we can go into the questions.
All right, great. So I'm going to walk us through sort of how, again, this conceptual model of Lightning Web Components for us. And at the core of it is just web components. And the value of web components, as Katie mentioned, is this notion of we want interoperability, a common component model, standards-based, sort of bring your own tools, backwards compat, as the web has done for multiple decades now. And the code that looks like, right, is that it's really powerful. Web components are an incredibly low-level API, minimally opinionated, that allow you to do a tremendous amount of things. But at the same result, it's also verbose. It's powerful and verbose. So you see some code on here. This is a standard web component. You can go and author it, run it in your browser, et cetera. And you see things in here like the connected callback, the disconnected callback. You see the attribute change callback. that notifies you when an attribute has changed. So if you want to reflect, for example, attributes you receive back as imperative properties that you can access in JavaScript, you have to take that on yourself. It's really low level, but very powerful, part of the standard. So what we did is we took that and we wrapped it with what we call Lightning Web Components. And so Lightning Web Components brings you stuff like developer productivity. It brings you stuff like performance and security. And we're helping to fill some of those gaps in that specification that you need as enterprise developers, like accessibility. So where the spec is growing and it's maturing and the spec isn't perhaps fully finalized and hasn't delivered to a stage 4 spec, for example, that every browser supports, we're trying to fill those gaps in a very careful way, balancing this line of getting the core capabilities to you quickly, while also doing it in a backwards and forwards compatible way. So in contrast to the code you just saw a second ago, this is what an LWC component looks like that you're probably all familiar with, right? So to map that back to the code you saw before, you do some imports from LWC, but the mapping and the reflection, for example, of the attributes you receive in and how to access them as properties, you do with that @API decorator. And similarly with track to do reactivity, we built in for you. So using our template system, anytime that mutates, we trigger the re-render for you. So the key takeaway here really is we're focused on developer productivity and doing syntactic sugar on top of the base web components. So fundamentally, when you write an LWC component, and now with the open source stuff, you can generate and output pure web components. They register as custom elements. There's regular web components. But you just get, in our view, a nicer developer experience. So Salesforce being Salesforce, we're also, of course, a metadata company. So when you build Lightning Web Components inside of Platform, and you want to access stuff like Apex in your schema, you want to reference other packages, other components in your namespace and outside, we also build up a ton of metadata around that to make that experience good. We can understand when you're making a breaking change, what your dependencies are, so we can auto-determine dependencies of chain sets and packages as you push them out. And so as you see here, it also gives us the ability to add metadata around things like the builders. So you write a web component, and we allow you to express through the XML file, right? Here are the targets for it. It can only be used on a record homepage or an app page. It can only be used in the console experience versus the standard Lightning experience and communities and so forth. So there's lots of extra metadata there. And that metadata in code looks like this. So we have standard patterns for you to express it, and we apply a lot of static analysis to extract that. So what's highlighted here are the imports, right? We aligned on standard ES6 imports, but have you express them in a way that we can do analysis to understand that dependency set. So up here we've got things like dependencies on your labels, dependency on schema, both S-objects and custom fields. We've got stuff for the wire decorator to be able to pull data, but you can also access, as you know, Apex and all sorts of other stuff. And that list is going to grow in the future. So again, at its base, we've got web components, Lightning Web Components as syntactic sugar on top, and a lot of metadata then on top of that. Extending that further, we get context. So that context is things like which apps can you run it in, how do we do server-side rendering, what form factors do you support, doing instrumentation and telemetry around it as well. So that's our core conceptual model of how we view web components. And again, that root of it is Lightning Web Components is focused on syntactic sugar to improve developer productivity, to fulfill enterprise requirements. The notion that you're going to have to ship things that work across browsers. You need to support building accessible applications. You need to support localizable applications. So we give you those capabilities as core patterns that we impress upon you. Continuing, the takeaway here again is we're built just on web components. That's all it is. So we're aligned with standards. So this stuff, as the web component standard grows and matures, Lightning Web Components grows with it, and everything, the intent is Lightning Web Components itself is going to shrink as the inner ring of the standard grows. That's our intent. When the spec gets larger, covers more of the use cases that you need, we can shrink basically our framework, our engine will get smaller and smaller and just become more of the standard. A couple key things, obviously, performance, especially in contrast to what we did with Aura. As you guys know, Aura was big, it's heavy, and it was necessary at the time that we built it, right? Think back 8 years ago. Think about what the JavaScript world was like 5 years ago even. Things have changed a lot, and you've seen those graphs comparing the stack of 2015 versus the stack of 2019. There's a big difference there. The ability to evolve, right? So as Katie mentioned, the web platform, a key invariant is to never break the web. They've done a tremendous job saying every change we make is always backwards compatible, and they're very careful in their design to be forwards compatible as well. And that, again, hopefully that resonates with all of you as you're building applications and building on us, that we have those same invariants and those same promises to you. Last one, we mentioned portability because of web components. You can take this stuff outside, intermix it with other frameworks, and so forth. So I want to pivot and talk about our roadmap. And so part of this interactive conversation and set of questions we're going to have is to get your feedback. And through both this conversation, through our open sourcing of it, through the projects on GitHub, through pull requests and issues, we want to hear from you. So let me just say, as I see a lot of people taking photos, this is all safe harbor again. Don't promise any of this. But this is what we're looking at. This is the direction we're looking at. And what we want to hear from you is whether this resonates with you or whether we're missing stuff that's really important to you or details of how you would change it. So treat this as some seeds of ideas for the subsequent conversation we're about to start having. So with that, we've got a mic in the middle. I encourage people to hop into line, and we'll just basically allow you to panel question us with anything you'd like to know. I've got 3 URLs up there, which I want you to make note of as we might direct you to them. The first one is just for the main core engine, right, which we've open sourced. We may suggest as you give us feedback to say, give us capability X or Y. Sounds great. File an issue for us. The second one is our RFC repo. So when we do the design of LWC, we internally go through a process of basically doing a design doc and a request for comments on it. Standard process that a lot of groups follow. We're using the exact same process. We've got a repository with all of our RFCs in it. So we encourage you to check those out, and you'll see where we're going. You'll see the designs actively being discussed that we're going to be releasing the next 1, 2, 3, and beyond releases. So get involved in that. You can issue your own pull requests and put up your own RFCs to solicit feedback to drive where this core engine's going. And the last one is all the test capabilities, all wrapped up in a single repo for you to go check out as well. If you missed a talk earlier today, ironically in this room about 2 hours ago by Trevor Bliss and Ray, check out the recording, stellar talk.
Yeah, also, the history of many of the decisions that we made are there in those repos. So you can, RFCs has a lot of info about decisions that we make in the last 2 years.
Cool, so I'll leave this slide up, and we'll move to questions. And so thanks for being the first person to stand up.
Test. There we go. Now it's. Thank you. I've been on LWC for 4 months. Thank you. I'm hooked. Couple of questions. First of all, could you provide some documentation on the order of operation when a component loads, with regard to callback, connected callback, wire, etc. So that's one thing. I'm not expecting a big answer here, but just a request. Second thing, in the target configs in the meta file, it would be great. I know you can specify objects. It would be great if you could specify properties by object, so that you can have different descriptions, for example, depending on which page it gets dropped on.
So on the first one, if you go to the first repo, I think there is a documentation folder that has a bunch of architect diagrams where we have the different stages and callbacks and when they are called and what triggers them to be called. I think that's still in that or in the RFCs.
Yeah, but we should certainly put it on the main page.
Yep, so it's in that docs folder. It is part of the public LWC doc guide as well, and the dev guide. It's in there, and now it's just on LWC dev as well. Correct, Diego?
Yeah, but I think maybe we haven't documented exactly the specific life cycles for the wire and when that relates to any other life cycles. Maybe we're missing that piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
Feedback.
Hi. So new to Lightning Web Components, but the concept of web components is not new. It's been around for a long time. Polymer's been around for a really long time. Polymer's been around for a really long time, and they haven't really gotten a lot of traction, and there are other web component frameworks. So what is it about Lightning that Polymer didn't do and that you think does better and you think will actually catch on in the web dev community?
Yeah, so I think, so that's a very good question. What components are getting more mature now? All the accessibility, form, integration, all these things are happening now. So 2 years back, it was not really there. Polymer also didn't work in i11. There is a polyfill that you can load, but it's impossible to debug. You cannot open the dev tool or any of that. We put a lot of effort. If you go into i11, for example, you will see the shadow DOMs, and you can navigate and use the same things that you use in new browsers. That's important for us, so people can solve problems. Additionally, we have been very, very careful about not giving you all the things. And I was talking to early to Kevin and Diego, like we put a lot of restrictions in LWC. You will see restrictions intentionally there for that reason, because we're not sure about how that will work in the future. So we prefer to put a break on it, and eventually we will lift those restrictions slowly. And we feel that we have a solid foundation. You don't have to learn a new authoring format. So Polymer has a author format that is created by Google, and that's something that you have to learn. We don't do that. We try to keep it as dry as possible. And also, Google is also investing on lit HTML, which is the new Polymer, I will say. So even in that case, they're still changing the ways that you use web components. It's a fine balance. I think we try to be as much as simple as possible, down to the metal, and eventually lift the restrictions so you can do what you can do in a regular web component.
So are there new parts of the standard that have been ratified now that sort of enable you to kind of do new things that Google wasn't doing, or what? I'm trying to
yeah, the fact that the fact that web components was not in all the browsers was a big problem. Now it is in all browsers, including Edge, the new Edge, based on Chromium. Is only missing in I11 basically.
Yeah, and I think it's been a journey. Like I think Google took a bullet very early, right? And I think now everyone's mindset has changed a little bit, and I think every framework a little more and more is looking to web components. And our goal as a platform, right? The best way to future-proof our platform is to align with the standards, right? And so I think it fits really well. And our goal is eventually, in 5 years, to LWC to disappear, right? When everything is implemented, everything is native, LWC is just going to be a compile step, and everything is going to be just native to the browser, right? So so that's kind of where we're going, and we believe that implementers such as Google, Apple, Firefox, Mozilla are in that direction. They're all really committed to web components, so we really think that we didn't know that 2 years ago, but that's a bet we took, and it turns out we were kind of right, so hopefully we continue to be right.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention one thing, like the abstractions that Kevin mentioned, those abstractions are really not APIs that you have to learn. We actually put abstractions that you don't have to learn. We are opinionated about how you structure your code. We are opinionated about a few things that you have to do and few proprietary APIs like the decorators and such, but those are minimum. The underlying code is actually almost identical to a vanilla web component.
Okay.
And one other point, just to go along with this, is we're showing up to more and more standards meetings, and we're not the only enterprise company doing that. A lot of these standards bodies in the past were really doing kind of the theoretical approach. But even in the last meeting in Toronto, they're like, hey, Salesforce, what are your scenarios here? So we're bringing all the Trailblazer scenarios to the standards as well and trying to influence. We're not waiting to see what happens. We're actually there and part of the conversation.
Cool. One last thing. If you can kind of talk on state management, how does Lightning Web Components think about state management in non-trivial applications where you've got large portions of the application that need to talk to each other and not necessarily in similar areas of the DOM. So if you can kind of elaborate on how you guys think about that, and if there's things that you recommend to leverage on top, or thank you.
Yeah, I'll repeat the question just to be sure we get it right. You're asking, what are our thoughts on how to do state management? So, and I think specifically you're asking about when you don't have a parent-child relationship, you've got basically, as a concrete example, multiple effectively experience components that you want to support in a builder to drop onto a Flexi page, I think is what you're asking. Okay, I'll take that. That's a great way to phrase it. Like, what's the redux of Lightning Web Components? And so I think there's a couple answers. And the reason there's a couple answers is because there's a bunch of different use cases. And so a common pattern that has worked well that React made really popular was this notion of lift state up. So if you do have a common hierarchy, a common parent, make that parent responsible for the state of your children. So design your components to be effectively presentation components versus a container component, where the container does the data load, the data orchestration, and all the components under it are pure presentation. You give them values as props, They're responsible just for effectively composing other presentation components, doing a transform, and doing pure presentation. They don't do any API calls, no data mutation. If you want to mutate, you event up to your parent, that's a container, and it does it and reorchestrates data down. And that's effectively what Redux is, right? Like Redux is basically, you event up a bunch of actions, performs some operation, and then recascades values down via its higher order components. So that's one approach if you own the whole hierarchy. But we also have the benefit of things like ES6 modules, right, which are inherently singletons. And so on our platform, when you're in a Locker world, you can take advantage of that. So you can share, for example, state across arbitrary components anywhere in the page if that's your situation. We also shipped like a pub sub reference example rights, which we're going to formalize into a formally supported service, which can also help you basically scope communication to all your components that exist on a single Flexi page across multiple pages in a console experience, the utility bar, the global header, and basically abstract away the complexity of orchestrating while doing scoping of messaging. So I think it very much depends upon your use case. And I think that's actually quite a good, powerful thing.
Yeah, I would say that we cannot really please everyone by choosing one thing. So we'd rather prefer to give you the capabilities to use whatever you feel comfortable with. So we're not really pushing for something that implements a Redux or something like that.
If you guys want an example, there was a talk yesterday by David Turicini and Pierre Dartus, he's over there. So that he has an example that has a very complex use case of state management. It's actually open source as well. It's Aircast. He can share the URL. You can raise his hand, and you can talk to him later. Send you the URL. Or there's the talk yesterday. So that has a good example of a very complex use case of state management.
Yeah.
Off platform.
It was a really awesome presentation yesterday.
Closer to the mic.
Oh, I was just saying it was an awesome presentation yesterday. I had a question about Shadow DOM, you know, with it first launching with closed mode. And I think you were probably hinting at some of it where you've created an extraction, so to speak, of now we're in like custom. Just curious about like the thought process, how it's designed. You know, it's pretty.
I'm not sure I understand the question though.
I'm curious about the thought process around the shadow, like doing the Shadow DOM in closed mode, and now the evolution to what seems like a custom shadow. At least that's what it seemed like it was referenced in the documentation last.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the?
You should bring our executives here to talk about Shadow DOM.
So Shadow DOM, I'll cover a little bit, and Diego can cover the other one. So Shadow DOM is the encapsulation model for web components. That means that you're writing a component whose internal details are shadow from consumers of that component. That's the encapsulation model that we tried to put in place 3 years ago with Locker Service on Aura. And it happens to match very well with the Shadow DOM semantics. That's what we figured out 2 years ago or a year ago when we convinced everyone that goes with Shadow DOM was the right decision. I would say that in terms of the encapsulation, that's what we want for enterprise. No brainer there. Once we figure it clicks for us like, oh, this is what we want. In that sense, we're just following what web components are doing. On the synthetic shadow, I think that's a question like on implementation of it.
Yeah.
The problem is that the shadow itself is still not complete. There are many issues that are not solved, like, for example, accessibility, how you connect things from outside with things inside, like a label and an input inside the shadow. Those things are very difficult to do. There are other problems like form participation, like you have an input and a button inside the shadow. When you click on that button, which is the form that will trigger the submit. Those things are not specified yet. We're working on it with the standard and the browser vendors, but it's not ready yet. So what we decide to do is we're going to take the bullet and implement a polyfill that does everything that we want and a little bit more than that to solve all the problems for us. That's what we call synthetic shadow. So what you see today in production is not really a native shadow there, because if we put native shadow, people will freak out. Like tests will not work and all kind of problems. Styles will not be leaking from the top of the app. We have a lot of problems there. So we implement this synthetic shadow that follows the semantics almost to the T, but It has some extra sugar there that we allow certain things to happen as an evolution step toward the native shadow. When we're going to get the native shadow in production, in platform, I don't know. You can ask around here, these guys. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Well, the truth is, until the problems are solved, we won't have native shadow. Like if you can't test and it's accessible.
Certainly that's the direction we're going, and we believe the Shadow DOM, the encapsulation that it brings is good for all of you, and it's good for the ecosystem, right? For example, give me an example. Historically, every release, let's say we have Lightning button, and we decided because we want you to change a div to a span or a span to a div, right? And we will break a lot of you because you were doing CSS that it was reaching things that you should not be reaching, right? Or basically queries an element that you should not be querying, right? And so those things are good things that we want to prevent, right? We want to give a component should be private, or the internal component should be private, and everyone should have a specific API to talk to a component, right? So having that is good. And it has some side effects, which is, well, it's not that easy to do styling, for example, and we're working on that. But our goal is we believe that that's the right model, right? And we believe that we spent a lot of time on the specification especially with Google and Apple to get the accessibility, the form participation that Kelly was talking about. So again, overall, we believe it's the right direction. It's going to take us some time to get there. Also, the browsers need to get some work done to make the performance better. So that's the direction we're going. We believe that it's going to take a couple of years to get there. And hopefully you guys can give us feedback on, especially on CSS stuff, what are the things that you're missing that you will want to see so we can actually push the spec to.
But one thing that is important, in the open source, you can select what you want to use. By default, all the things that we have are using native shadow. That's the open source version of it. It's different in platform. Now, on the open source, if you don't want native shadow because you have the same problems that we have in the platform, you can disable the native shadow and use the synthetic shadow, but just enable one option. And now, it just works for you in I11 everywhere. You don't have to load any polyfill or anything. We do all the things for you. So that's an option. I think there is a to-do app that has the example how to you switch between the different modes, open mode, closed mode, synthetic, native. It has all kind of combinations of that. So look at it.
Yeah, we haven't open sourced that, but we'll probably land today or tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'll try to be quick, and I think this one might just go on Santa's wish list. But basically, if I have two components, I want to be able to drag and drop from one component to another component. Specifically, if I could have that in the app builder so that I could drag from one to the other and do assignment. It's a really weird use case. I know there's some Angular 7 components that have some features that allow for it, but I don't think that we can do it within Lightning Web Components right now.
Yeah, so today, one of the things that we have is that once you generate a DOM structure from a template, you cannot drag things into it because we don't allow that. It will mess up with it will give you an error basically. The first thing is that we're going to enable the draggable container, so you can describe this is a draggable container, so I can get things in there by dragging. There are other things that we have to enable that if I get the question correctly, in terms of the low-level LWC pieces that are needed to support that case. And then there might be other things that we have to do on the platform.
If you're asking the ability for you to create your own container components and be able to drag and drop components, yeah, that's something that is built on top of us. That will be the declarative platform. And we are looking at that. It's going to take a while to get some of the invariants right because there's a lot of complexity in terms of security, in terms of the generation of those components. So that's something that we're looking at, allowing you to create your own components so you can drag and drop them. But yeah, it's something that's not really on the engine itself.
Separately, currently with the way it's set up, if I have two different components that are sibling components, can I drag and drop between the sibling components, or is that the same because it's like an iframe?
Is it the container of it, a LWC component?
I would say two different LWC components.
But the container, the one that contains those two.
Oh, I could do a parent container to do is that what we're talking about?
No, I'm asking you if that container is also an LWC component.
Yes.
Then no.
Okay. If it's Aura, then...
No, that's what I was saying. In order for allowing drag and drop there, we need to give you a new directive that you can place in the container saying, my child can move around, and I will be fine with that. Because right now, if you try to move around, the child will tell you, no, you cannot do that. So we're working on this new, hopefully we will be working on this new way to describe that, similar to LWC DOM equal manual, very similar to that.
Yeah, we can follow up later to specifics because I think there's a lot of different nuances to that.
So first I want to say this is great. Thanks for the work you guys have done. I did have some questions about lists or rendering items, like the iterations. Is there a specification preventing it from being able to, the repeat being put on the element you want to repeat versus the template?
No.
Okay.
No,
You
no.
can do it on both.
Can you?
Yeah, either or is fine. We recommend doing it on the template, just it's semantically more clear, I think, to look at and understand, but you can put it directly on the element.
No, I think what you're asking is similar to view.
Yeah. Like if I have
slotting element.
Like I want to have like I'm repeating a list, and I'm going to repeat an LI, and I'd like the repeat on the LI, not on a template.
You can do that. It's not very well documented because we don't want people to do it, but you can.
Okay. All right. So then, if we do it the way you want people to do it, which means having the template and then repeating the LI and then putting the component that I actually want to render, do you guys have any plans to make it so we can extend native HTML elements so I don't need the LI? Because now I have the template, the LI, and then the actual component I want to show multiple times.
Yeah, so you can, if you get a chance, go and talk to Apple about it, because Apple doesn't want to implement the ease, which is a way to customize a built-in to be a custom element. So we have been battling with that for two years now, and Apple is reluctant to implement that. It's the only browsers, and until we get Apple to buy into the idea that you can say that UL or that LI is something that I want to control via a class, we cannot enable that. In fact, first version of LWC had that, and we kill it, remove that thing, because we're waiting for that. Sometimes we have to wait for the sky to be clear so we can enable things, and this is one of the cases.
Okay, and they have a booth downstairs, right? I can just
go there.
It's a different team, but yeah.
Good luck with that.
We're not saying you have to talk to Apple. We'll continue to talk to Apple.
So yeah, so what we have, what has worked for us, for example, is instead of using ULI, basically you can have your custom component container and your components. So instead of ULI, you have your my fancy container, my fancy LI, right? So you replace your components to have the same semantics as a ULI. You can do that. And we have, if you look at Lightning Card and some of those components, that's the structure we use. The only caveats there's some specific semantics like tables that you have to actually put a TR and TD and things like that. But for things like lists, you can it's actually good instead of having to put a UL and an LI and then your component, you can just remove the UL and the LI and just remove all those wrappers. You don't need them for most of the cases.
So do you lose anything from the semanticing for like accessibility with screen readers and whatnot?
Yeah, you can put the roles and everything, and it works pretty well in all browsers, so yeah.
Okay, cool, thank you.
We should have an example for that.
Hi, so my question is really, was that really loud? I'm sorry. So it's more about backwards compatibility. So as you guys are probably aware, there's a fair number of people that are still on Salesforce Classic, and they have no roadmap on updating to Lightning.
Is there people in Classic still?
Yeah, there are. And unfortunately, as a developer, I'd hope everybody would be on Lightning so I could start using your latest technologies. But unfortunately, my PM's like, well, it needs to work on Classic or bust, right? And so I've talked to other Salesforce employees here who are also aware of like the problems with the backwards compatibility. For me, the one I specifically encountered was navigation, where in Lightning you have the awesome navigation mix-in and it takes care of all the problems, and then as soon as you switch to Classic, the links don't work. And that had to do with the whole SForce and SForce1.object and all that. So I was just wondering, because you guys had that roadmap slide up, and there wasn't anything about that. And so if I can get somebody's email, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But it's just encountering things like this lead to more concerns, like, oh, I found out this, and this wasn't really documented anywhere, so, because there's some guy who wrote a blog article on it, and I was like, oh, okay, that's how you kind of solve that. So what other things have I not considered in terms of backward compatibility, having one app run on both Classic and Lightning, having a very similar user experience, if not the same? And are there any plans on solving that navigation issue in the near future?
Well, yeah, not really about LWC, so we probably will dodge that one a little bit. But yeah, I don't have any comments on this one.
So yeah, I don't. We can talk later, but I don't see. So we have. We're not looking at any backward compatibility in sense of this is working Classic. We do want 100% backward compatibility to everything we have built in Lightning for the ends of time, right? So anything you build today, we want to make sure that that works in 10 years. Now, when it comes to compatibility with Classic, it's a very tricky question because technically we support i7 in Classic, and just by nature there's no way we can polyfill some of the things. So LWC will not work in Classic, right? Like if you're in i7 or i9, right? So yeah, in terms of that, I don't think we have any. We don't have any testing or any backward compatibility for Classic because we just don't support that use case for new stuff. However, we do support. We do have all the backward compatibility for Lightning. That's kind of what I can tell you. And so I don't know which issues you have in navigation, but we can talk about that maybe offline.
Hello. So it's my understanding we cannot render dynamically Lightning Web Components. And since we are trying to go there and we are dynamically creating Aura components, I was thinking about having an Aura component as a wrapper and inside the Lightning Web component. But leaving that aside, is there in the roadmap a solution for that?
Next question. So, do you want the short answer or the long answer?
The one that's
so let me explain because I think it's really important to explain, right? So, when we were designing LWC, we had a knowledge of all of the issues that we had before with Aura and all of the mistakes we made and all of the mistakes that people normally fall into, right? And one of them was in Aura you have $a.create component, right? It's a beautiful, magical API. The problem with that is that 99% of the people, even in platform and outside platform, were using it wrong. What I mean wrong is using it for every single thing, to fetch dynamically label, to fetch dynamically like a little tiny component, and that costs a lot of performance for us, right? And even internally we have...
You're out.
Even internally we had a lot of issues scaling because the dependency gets very tricky. Which component depends on what, when. So we decided on LWC to start with, no, you cannot dynamically or lazy load components, right? And that was on the slide earlier. We purposely knew that a lot of people will ask, and we purposely knew there is some really use cases that are actually valid, right? Like, I'm pretty sure you have some.
Yep.
Some of those will be valid, some of them will not. But
sure.
So we know that there is a need for that. We just wanted to start the first release without allowing that. And what we want, if you go again to the talk from PM, it speaks a little about the different trade-offs. One, basically, the ability to have trees that are statically verifiable first. So even for ourselves, we try to be remember, every time you have a dynamic import, it's basically an unknown. When that thing is going to be loaded, where the dependency is going to be there, is it going to be a problem for performance, how do I test a component that is dynamically loaded? There's a lot of problems. And there's a big post I wrote in Stack Overflow on why we went with that. But we know that it's important, and we know eventually when you're building a platform and you need to dynamically load things. So we are planning to eventually expose it, but we're going to try to expose it in a granular level. First, we're going to give you access to. First, you're going to be able to import the specific things, like, hey, I'm going to dynamically load something, but you need to tell me what that something is. And eventually, as we go and progress with documentation, we will give you more and more room for doing more crazy stuff. But we wanted to handhold the platform there because we have seen a lot of bad practice that lead to a lot of performance problems. So we just want to, we did it on behalf of trying to do the right thing. But so we will, going back to in open source, you can do whatever you want, right? Yeah. And again, if you go to Pierre's talk, he talks about how he did it on code splitting, all that kind of good stuff. We want to do the same thing on platform, but we just want to have a little bit more maturity as we enable everybody to do the same thing.
One note on this is that when you start looking at the code in open source, especially on the engine, you will see a lot of APIs that says in bold, experimental. Those are the things that you do not have access in core, in our platform, but in the open source you can access them. Those are experimental. and we plan to change them and make them better and such. So be careful about that. And one of them is a create element that you can use to create elements dynamically on the open source. So be careful.
And to answer your question, sorry, Gavin, if you really have to,
Yeah.
you have no other choice, yes, doing the auto wrapping might work.
In the meantime, let's say.
Before you go that route, the thing I was going to say was as Diego said, right, when we designed it, we looked internally, for example, like through our repository, there's more than 5,000 components we have in-house. And of those, we found 2 or 3 use cases out of hundreds of uses that actually necessitated it. And so my point in saying this is that often there are other patterns that are actually better for you. And they're better because they enable things like static analysis. And so like a very concrete example, right? You've probably used Lightning Record Form.
No.
Okay.
You should.
How many have used Lightning Record Form? Show of hands. Okay, I think it's an awesome component. You basically say, I want to display an S object, and here are the fields I want to display, or here's the layout I want to display. Input, output takes care of all of CRUD on it. Super handy, really easy. One of the key components in there is Lightning Input Field and Lightning Output Field. And you would think, well, it supports, in fact, all the ballpark about 30 data types that our schema supports. That doesn't use dynamic component creation. It literally has an if block in it that says, if I am a text area, do this. If I'm a short text, do that. If I'm a number, do this, etc. Is it long to type out? It totally is. It's 60 lines of code. But it's also fully statically verifiable. So when we fetch that component at runtime and load it to a browser, we guarantee all of the dependencies for all the types are fetched at the right time. All the labels, all the format logic is pulled down in a single go. And that's actually remarkably more performant than saying, at runtime, we'll just ship a shim of it and then dynamically go and fetch as you need independently and asynchronously. So my point is, more often than not, if the domain of your dynamicism is actually fixed, you know there's only n solutions, do n if blocks, and you'll get static analysis out of it. And that will then allow you to do things like tooling on top of it, where you can say, where is every place that I have a dependency on this component? When you start doing the dynamic thing in Aura with $a create component and you start doing string concats, sort of all bets are off in terms of you ever being able to trace through your code and for us to do any static analysis of that stuff.
Okay.
So I was hoping that that question was not going to be asked, but we have no more time at this point, but we will be around for questions, and we will be happy to take them here or outside.
All right, thanks very much.